In both representations which have just come before us, there is present the unity of self-consciousness and spiritual essence, but they are still not equally balanced against each other. In the Bacchic enthusiasm, it is the self that is beside itself, but in corporeal beauty, it is spiritual essence. The stupor of consciousness and its wild stammering utterance in the former case must be taken up into the clear existence of the latter, and the non-spiritual clarity of the latter into the inwardness of the former. The perfect element in which inwardness is just as external as externality is inward is, once again, speech. But it is neither the speech of the oracle, wholly contingent and individual as regards its content, nor the emotional hymn sung in praise of the individual God, nor again is it the meaningless stammer of the Bacchic frenzy. On the contrary, it has gained a lucid and universal content, a content that is lucid, because the artist has worked his way out of the initial enthusiasm, originating wholly from substance, into a definite shape. This shape is his own existence, which in it, all its stirrings and impulses is permeated and accompanied by a self-conscious soul. And the content is universal, for in this festival which honors man, there vanishes the one-sidedness of the statues which contain only a national spirit, a specific character of the divine nature. The handsome warrior is indeed the glory of his particular nation, but he has a corporeal individuality in which are swallowed up the fullness and seriousness of meaning in the inner character of the spirit which bears the particular life, the demands, the needs, and customs of his nation. In this kenosis, this externalization of itself into complete corporeality, spirit has laid aside the special influences and sympathies of nature, which, as the spirit of the nation, it contains shut up within it. Its nation is, therefore, no longer conscious in this spirit of its particularity, but rather of having laid this aside, and is conscious of the universality of its human existence. Paragraph 726 brings to a close this subsection of the pretty sizable religion portion of the work. It's always a good idea to take a little pause and think about where Hegel is going to have us going after this and the ground that we have traversed up until this point. And I think particularly with the ending of this section, that can be quite helpful. So where are we going next? Well, let's remind ourselves of where we currently are. We're in a middle section of the religion portion of the work. And this middle section has been about the religion of art. And you could say, well, there hasn't actually been a ton of discussion of art. As a matter of fact, we've talked probably more about this cult, in German, cultus, and the location or mediation that it's providing between the human being, the worshiper, and the God. And, it has this function of bringing together a community, the ethical nation that Hegel keeps talking about. And that's all true. But we have seen some development taking place in going back from the natural religion section, which culminated in the worker of the art, right? The Werkmeister, and where we have this transition to the Künstler, the actual artist. And we have all sorts of ways in which we're working with things that are kunstliche, right? Artistic, creative, you could say. But creative in the way of transforming nature and also culture into something that can stand in for and allow the communication of the divine. And I'm using that word communication deliberately given the content of this section. And where are we going next? Well, the spiritual work of art. And here is where Hegel is going to turn his attention to things like the epic, right? And the way in which the gods and even more importantly, human beings are depicted in the epic and then the tragedy. So we're talking essentially about something that was very important for Germans and indeed Europeans of that time, ancient Greece. Ancient Greece is taken as sort of like the place in which civilization, or as Hegel would say, spirit is moving itself forward. I don't think personally that we have to confine ourselves to the perspective that Hegel himself more or less willfully adopts, thinking a very Hellenocentric way of looking at things, because if we are attentive to what happens in the religions and the art of other cultures, other civilizations in the world, we'll see similar dynamics playing themselves out. And I think we can say that also about this subsection that we're in. So there's this progression that is taking place here. We've had natural religion in the past. We moved on to religion in the form of art, and we had a previous section where it was the abstract work of art, gave us, the mediation, the cult, and all that. We had a transition just recently in this living work of art to saying, the natural or nature gods of Dionysos or Bacchus and Ceres, Demeter, are not adequate for the religion that we're talking about here. There's other gods, higher gods, that we're going to have to engage with, gods that are more universal in a certain sense. And we move away from just the statue, and all of that provides us with to a human being and the human body inhabited by spirit, an incarnated spirit, you could say, as the new locus that we have to pay attention to. And that's what's happening in this final paragraph of this subsection. We can also say that, once again, language, Sprache, or speech, however you want to translate it, is now coming to the prominence. And there's something going on here that's really quite interesting. Hegel is telling us what kind of language we're not talking about, languages or modes of language that we've already brought up and explored. He's not fully telling us what the new mode of language is, and why is he not doing that? Well, it's being developed in the next subsection, right? And once we finish the spiritual work of art, which is quite a long section, right? Or subsection, rather, we are going to get to the revealed religion. And we've already seen some discussion of Offenbarung, revelation, manifestation, the way that Miller translates it, in this subsection that we've just, or are now, finishing up with. So let's look at the actual text. So he says, in both representations, what are the representations? The Darstellungen, right? And the representations are the statue within the locus of the cult, not just the statue in an art textbook or in a museum or all by itself in a vacuum, you might say, but the statue that exists for the cult worshipers intergenerationally, providing them with a place to encounter the God, and also, do their own work with the statue and around the statue. What is the other one? The human being, like you said, going back to the previous paragraph, the one who comes forward, who is the pattern movement, the smooth elaboration and fluent energy of all the participants, the inspired and living work of art that matches strength with beauty. So what we're talking about there is a human being who may have a whole bunch of other extras in the great drama around them, but who is in some respect incarnating, representing, providing a locus for the encounter with the God. But notice as well that in the previous paragraph and in this paragraph, Hegel is very much making this not just about the God as some transcendent, inaccessible thing like it was way back in the self-consciousness section, where there was this infinite distancing between the eternal and the human being and the unhappy consciousness. Now the individual person who has been selected is incarnating the God, and Hegel says that in both representations there's something there, right? What is there? The unity of self-consciousness. The self-consciousness section, again, is worth thinking about. The unity of self-consciousness that was not there in the self-consciousness section, not there in the unhappy consciousness, but now is available in this mode, right? And spiritual essence, geistige Wesen. But, there's a very important but here, they're not on the same level. He says they're not equally balanced against each other. One is better than the other. One is more developed than the other. One represents a progression, an achievement, a culturation, right? Bildung that is developing through religion. So he talks about two things. Bacchic enthusiasm, which we've encountered before, the untamed revelry of nature in self-conscious form, right? And he says that what we have there is the self beside itself. Now that's a interesting mode, all right? Selbst außer sich, the self outside of itself, not just beside itself, outside of itself. It is, to use another word that Hegel doesn't bring up a lot, but say Heidegger does, and so do other people around that time influenced by him, ecstatic, right? It stands outside, but is still the same thing. So the Bacchic enthusiasm is something, now enthusiasm, the God blowing into you, the spirit of the God going into you, right? But this places you in an ecstatic state where you can't really grasp your own self-consciousness because in a way you're losing yourself. What about corporeal beauty? He says, in corporeal beauty, it is spiritual essence. So it better captures what spiritual essence, geistige Wesen, actually is. And the rest of this paragraph is drawing out what this is supposed to mean. He tells us the stupor of consciousness, its wild, stammering utterance in the former case. So those are not good things. Stammering, blah, 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 right? It doesn't actually know what it's saying. The stupor, it has enthusiasm. It is ecstatic, but, this is a bit of a digression here, right? Sometimes people want to make Hegel into a mystic or, some sort of person who's into, could be connected with psychedelics. Hegel is not like that at all. Hegel is for things being made manifest to a rational being and being able to be shared between us, not some secret little thing that you have by yourself for the initiated. You could say that there is a Hegelian initiation, but it's an initiation of and through the dialectic, which is what is available to us as human beings and has become more and more available to us over time, including through religion. So he says, these need to be taken up into the clear existence of the latter, corporeal beauty, and the non-spiritual clarity of the latter into the inwardness of the former. Now, here's where he says something, I think, very worthwhile mulling over. He talks about this relationship between inwardness and externality or exteriority. Right? He says, the perfect element in which inwardness is just as external as externality is inward. So before we say what that is, let's think about that for a moment. We talk about ourselves, right? We all have, a world inside of ourselves that we're not entirely conscious of and which can be brought to consciousness through memory, recalling things. I mean, this is something that has been known for a long time. The notion that interiority or inwardness is a particularly modern thing, that's nonsense. You can find this in all these great spiritual traditions and in ancient philosophy and culture in the Western world. So this notion of there being an inwardness to us and that the inwardness is in some respect greater, deeper, more complex than that of raw being like a stone or plants or animals. This is something really central. At the same time, inwardness exists through externalizing itself. How do you know that somebody has a thought? You can't crack their head open and look inside, you need to actually see the expression of that thought. And very often, as we've seen in the Hegelian dialectic, going from the idea to the actuality, the Wirklichkeit, the reality of something, there's usually a disconnect between those while there's also a continuity. And we get to see what an idea really looks like when it's put into action. So, externality itself also has a kind of inwardness. Things are not just what they appear to be on the surface, even in the externality of them. So we can go inside and find something more by actually paying attention to what's out there and what we consider to be the superficial or the merely practical. We also find more. How do we do that? What's the medium for that? Language. Speech, Sprache. This too is part of our human nature. This too is something that has developed over time and become more complex. This too is something where we have a task of reintegration and interpretation and understanding going on. This is very important. So he says, the perfect element in which inwardness is just as external as externality is inward is, once again, speech. Now he tells us what it isn't. What kind of speech are we not talking about or no longer talking about, while these do remain in place as part of the way religion is done, right? So he says, it's neither the speech of the oracle. The oracle, why not? Because this is wholly contingent and individual as regards its content, right? The oracle is arbitrary. I mean, it's telling you things. Oftentimes you're like, well, what the hell does that mean? Sometimes you find that out to your detriment. Think about the case of Cresius, right? Or for that matter, Socrates, right? The other, nor the emotional hymn sung in praise of the individual God. Nothing wrong with hymns. We've seen that hymns convey something very important, but that's not what we're talking about here. Nor, he says, going on, the meaningless stammer of Bacchic frenzy, which is speech, but speech, you could say, in a degenerate or totally metaphorical or automatopoetic form, where we're saying like boom, 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 making some booms, right? Or whatever else it's going to be. What's wrong with these? Why are these not adequate or sufficient? So here Miller uses this term lucid. They lack lucid content. This is klar. He could have said clear content. Lucid sounds a little bit cooler, right? Lucidity. But there's also a lack of, as he's going to say, universal content. And he says, what we've got in the language that's being used here is a lucid and universal content, a content that is lucid. Why? Because the artist has worked his way out of the initial enthusiasm originating wholly from substance into a definite shape, a gestalt, right? This shape is what? Well, who's the artist here? So Hegel's moving through this pretty quickly. Who's the artist? It's the individual human being whose corporeality is what is being placed front and center. And you could say, corporeality, that's just your body. Well, what do you think you talk through or understand through? Language, which is not the body, but also is of and in and through the body, isn't it? So he says, this shape is his own existence, which in all its stirrings and impulses is permeated and accompanied by self-conscious soul. This is an important notion here. Hegel doesn't often talk that much in the Phenomenology about soul, Seele, right? But here he does. And what is the soul supposed to be? The individual inwardness of the person? Well, remember, the inwardness is becoming external, and it's becoming external in part through the body and what you see from the body, but also you could say the body as a communicative matrix. Not just talking, but gesture. Not just what it says, but also how it moves. And we could also imagine other elements in there as well. So he says that the content is universal. Why? In this festival, which honors man or humanity, Mensch, right? What is actually being dealt with? He says, there vanishes the one-sidedness of the statues. And what's wrong with the statues? The statues are, in some respect, too particular, too confining. They are, you could say, a not quite universal. So a statue of Hera or Zeus or Athena or Poseidon or pick whoever else you like, or it could be a mosaic, could be whatever else you want, is a static representation of a particular manifestation of divinity, of the theos, the God that is beyond the human. He says, the statues have a one-sidedness which contain only a national spirit. Very interesting term here. Nationalgeist. He doesn't say a spirit of a people. Instead, he uses this word nation, Nationalgeist. The mind, you could say, the mentality of a nation, of a grouping of human beings that identifies itself as such. So Athena could represent Athens. And we could say, is this the Athena of Athens or the Athena of this Athenian colony when we look at particular statues, right? Hera, Zeus, more transnational in the sense of applying to many different city-states. Each statue is still like the Zeus of Corinth or the Zeus of Thebes or things like that. And Hegel goes on and he says, so this one-sidedness vanishes, a specific character of the divine nature. What's replacing it? He says, the handsome warrior is indeed the glory of his particular nation, but something else is happening here. What else is happening? He is a corporeal individuality in which are swallowed up the fullness and serious of meaning and the inner character of the spirit which bears what? There's a nice listing here. The life, Leben, demands, Anliegen, the needs, Bedürfnisse, the things that are being, shown to be necessary, and the customs, the Sitten. Customs, we could say mores is quite important. Bears the particular life that demands the needs, the customs of his nation. So any particular person who is engaging in this religious expression, involved with language in some way, but also through his corporeal or her corporeal individuality, is both representing all of this, the national spirit, the life demands, needs, customs of their nation. They don't come from nowhere, right? They are an Athenian. They are a Theban. They are a Spartan. They are whoever they happen to be. But at the same time, they become something more universal than that. How so? Well, here's where Miller is actually adding something. In this kenosis, this externalization of itself into complete corporeality. Kenosis is not there in the text. What is kenosis? That is a theological term that comes from meditating on the emptying of oneself of this figure, Jesus Christ, in Christian theology and practice and texts, It comes from the word kenos, which means empty or vain. Like when we talk about vainglory, that's kenodoxia, right? So kenosis is this emptying. In Christianity, the incarnate God-man is willing to die on the cross, is willing to allow himself to be subjected to humiliations, torture, scourging, and execution, and actually die. Right? This is going to be talked about more in the coming section, the revealed religion, so we don't have to talk about that much here. But there is similar things happening, as we've seen already, discussion. For example, the God is willing to let itself be bread for us or wine for us. And we could think about this in terms of other major significant parts of human life as well. The gods are willing to externalize themselves. And this is what happens here. So Hegel talks about this externalization and Äußerung of itself. And of what self? Well, both of the God, but also of the actor, the dancer, the individuality who is representing with their very body the God in this festival, and thereby also human being. And Äußerung is this externalization is something different than merely Bacchic enthusiasm, having the self outside of itself, ecstatic things. It is externalizing itself into complete corporeality, he says. And he says, spirit has laid aside the special influences and sympathies of nature, which as the spirit of the nation, it contained shut up within it. And this is where we can talk about like the geography, the particularity of these people identifying, say, with a forest or with a river or with the sea, or pick whatever else you want. That's all nature, and nature is not to be just gotten rid of or despised, but it is to be transcended. And one way that you can do this is through this progression here, through language. And if you think about this for a minute, how the hell are we, 21st century late moderns, able to get anything and make any sense out of ancient Greek, or for that matter, Egyptian, or Hebrew, or Iranian, and we could go all over the world with this, religion? Well, it's not just by going to museums and looking at religious artifacts or statues and being like, oh, wow, that's really cool, Look how they depicted Zeus or Ahura Mazda or Thoth, or pick whoever else you want. We do so by reading the literature and thinking about it, right? That is coming through language. That's how we recapture, reinterpret some of this. We would do so even more if we did have a cultus and we had a representative of it as the perfect corporeality in this case, but very often we don't have that, right? So he goes on and he says, its nation is therefore no longer conscious in this spirit of its particularity. It's setting aside its particularity, and it becomes conscious of the universality of its human existence. Now, how is it doing that? Again, this is a bit confused at this point. We don't have a real resolution ending this paragraph because we've got a tension here between language, which is, okay, it is corporeal in that we talk with our mouths and hear with our ears and tippy-tap on our keyboards and look with our eyeballs, and we could go on and on. Even braille, we can feel language. There is that. And yet there's also the, in some respect, muteness of the corporeal individuality, but these are being brought together as something greater than these other forms of language, including that of the Bacchic frenzy. So the stage is being set for a new way of understanding, a new way of worshiping, And that's where this section is coming to a close.